we talked about the life of Jeremiah. There was a younger prophet, a much younger person than Jeremiah, called Ezekiel. And I think that Ezekiel was the first prophet I had studied in depth. That is because the storyline, unlike Jeremiah, is in chronological order, and we are also given dates, precise dates, when various prophecies were uttered. And when you read the book of Ezekiel, if you have a good book with an outline of it, you will see that very clearly. We are given clear dates to do with. What was unusual about Ezekiel is the way he starts, and even before it starts. And when I gave a series of talks in America to some evangelical Orthodox churches, I think 5, I used Ezekiel as my tool to get me around. Only on one of them did I give an overview of the 4 Gospels when I was with them. With Ezekiel, it seems to have happened like this. There was a well-to-do family, and they wanted their son to enter into one of the most important jobs if they were of the tribe, and that was to go and be a priest, and maybe even one day the high priest. Always had that kind of dream. And Ezekiel was such a person. And he was brought up as a child, as a boy, in the temple, Solomon's temple. That magnificent temple, that incredible temple. That temple, the people said, was one of the wonders of the world, and definitely the wonder of the world as far as religious temple was concerned. And he's being taught how to be a priest. He's been taught how the sacrifices were made, and how people would bring the animals at days of covenant and days of atonement, and how the hand of the person would be identified with the sacrifice in the killing of the sacrifice, and how the blood would be spilt, and how part of the meat would be given to the priesthood, and the rest they would be taken home to eat and to remember the covenant of the Passover. Yes, oh yes, he knew his priesthood. He knew what it was to go and see inside the temple, not the holiest of all, that was reserved for only once a year. Experience God dwelling in darkness for a year. You have to imagine that somewhat. But it symbolized God's presence. And it was only symbolized, it wasn't real God's presence. God's presence was also with people. He was listening and hearing and trying to speak to the people. Anyway, the time came when the fears came, the Babylonians came. And when the Babylonians came, they took many of the young men. Took Daniel, for instance, first. The next raid, they took Ezekiel. And Ezekiel was about 25 years of age when he was taken. Whether he was married at that time, we don't know, but we know that he fell in love, passionately in love. The person he married was the apple of his eye, and that was God's description of the person he's married, not just Ezekiel's. Madly in love. Is not taken to the capital city like Daniel, and to be a person in some kind of high office academically and maybe management-wise. He's a priest, training to be a priest, and he's taken to a refugee camp. A refugee camp where they built their own houses. Either the Babylons or themselves had dug out a big canal, miles going round, taking the water from the Euphrates and back into the Euphrates, so they always had fresh water flowing around them. And inside that, they had various bridges, but inside that, they would build their houses. And whether they were taken X miles to help with various building projects in Babylon or not, I don't know. But what we do know, that the people in the refugee camps saw Ezekiel as a leader. And we're talking about the leaders that we find in the Bible of the Old Testament. When he was 30, maybe on the very day that he knows he would have been consecrated as a fully fledged priest, who for the next 20 years would work and work hard in the temple as a priest, in that privileged position. And from that position being able to be promoted from time to time. And a man with these gifts and abilities, one can imagine that could have happened. At that time, he sees something from the north. The north, the dreaded place that everybody was afraid of. And coming towards him, clouds and flashes of lightning in the clouds. And he knows this is the wrong time of the year for this kind of thing to happen. And he's fixed there, just on his own. And then slowly, the glory of God from a distant place. Who said God didn't love all the nations? From a distant place was coming closer to him. And what he sees is something fantastic. He sees a throne and a rainbow over the throne. And he sees 4 pillars. And these pillars have 4 different faces, reflecting the same face that's on the other pillars, but look in different ways. I visualized in my thinking that maybe the man was looking north, south, east, and west. So was the lion, so was the eagle, and so was the ox. Total vision going out. But when we talk about vision, there were wheels with eyes all over the place. And these wheels could go in any direction. It was a kind of a miracle piece of engineering. And on the throne was one like unto a man, the Son of Man. And it's from that experience that he hears that God has made him not a priest but a prophet. And not only a prophet, he was going to become a man of steel, a strong man, not a weak man, not a weak prophet. And he would tell the people the way he heard it and the way he saw it. And from that experience, he would have that experience again later in the book, but from that experience, he had an understanding of the glory of God in all the world. As you begin to read, and he says various things to the refugees camps about the future and the past and the present, and he acts various things out as symbols because he wants to impress them upon the people. He's caught up one day in a vision that transfers him all the way to the temple, that lovely, lovely temple that he had spent so much of his first 25 years in. And at that temple, he sees the most awful things taking place in the temple by the priesthood. And if God didn't tell him, he would have known that was the end. And it was the end. It actually has a sense of humour to it as well, because it says he broke through a wall and saw all the awful things that was taking place. They were worshipping other gods. They no longer wanted God in their life. They had turned their path on God. We see that with nations. We see nations where a large number of people become Christians, and over a period of time, less people become Christians. We are thrilled to see the growth of Christianity in places like Africa and other places, of course. But we're saddened when we see Europe, and even now the United States, losing people to the Lord. Well, they no longer wanted God in their lives. And what we see is this. We see the glory of God leaving the temple, then leaving the city, then leaving the nation. And where's the glory of God going? A refugee camp in Babylon. And the rest of the world, as we find in the book of Malachi, when you read book of Malachi. Well, the prophecies continue. He's now back in his refugee camp. Then one day God says to him, Ezekiel, give your wife a kiss this morning. I've got some sad news for you. This day your healthy, beautiful wife is going to die. And not only is she going to die, but Ezekiel, you cannot mourn for her in the way you mourn. You cannot wear your sackclothes, so other people will know you're crying for that beautiful woman who you love. And then you will know in your own being that my rejection of Jerusalem and the nation of Israel hurts me in the same way you will feel the pain of losing your wife. You will experience something of my suffering. I have been patiently, I've been warning them by my servants and the prophets. They wouldn't listen. And that day, Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians and was destroyed. And that day his wife died. And from that day the prophet became a pastor. The tone of his voice, the expressions and the visions that he had were pastoral. They were not the condemnational element that you find. The first thing you discover, that God all the time had been dealing with the nations. All the time. And he gives prophecies concerning the nations because of the stubbornness and hardness and cruelty and wickedness that they themselves have been doing. And after he's done that, he begins to see the future. He begins to see the shape of things to come for Ezekiel. One of them is the valley of dry bones, of which my editor reminded me of to mention it. The valley of dry bones, you'll come across it. Can these bones live? They've been dead. There's no life in them at all. There's no muscle. There's no skin. They're just skeletons. I once gave a story on the skeletons, the valley of dry bones, and I was able to borrow a skeleton from the local museum and bring it into the talk. How can you put flesh and blood and put all the elements and lungs and livers and heart back into? How can you make them live? But the Spirit of the living God came sweeping through, and there was an army for God. God's army. God's army that would take the gospel of Jesus Christ to the communities of people. He had other visions. He had a vision of a temple that would be 1,000,000 times more glorious than the temple that was ruined. It would be a huge temple, reach further than all the mountains of the world, would be as wide as it was high. It was an incredible, all people that's ever put their trust in God and called upon God, it could contain every one of them and still have plenty of room. Of course, it was a symbolic temple. There's no way you can ever think of people building this temple. Miles high, wide. How many rooms was there in? If Jesus was building that temple, there'll be a lot of rooms that have to be built. In my Father's house are many mansions, many rooms, many dwelling places. And then, having done that, he makes sure that on the temple there are 4 kitchens. Fellowship is always to do with food. That's not forgotten. Not 1, but 4. And then, although it has gates, they're open. There's accessibility. And then you see something else taking place. It's in another vision, and whether you connect it with the temple vision or whether it comes before or whether it comes afterwards, you can have a bit of guessing game on that. But in this vision, he sees from the very throne of God water flowing. And this water is going to heal the salt water that cannot be drank and of which things cannot grow. And before you finish, you see a water that is up to your ankles. You can only begin the journey of faith to be in the flow of God's eternal love, symbolized by the water. Then it's up to your knees. And then it's up to your waist, and now it is so strong you've got to commit yourself to it. You've got to swim in it. And what a lesson of faith that is, from the ankles to the knees to the waist. The starting, the praying, and being strong in the power of the Lord, in the power of his might. And that is the picture. And God is there in that picture that's created. The Old Testament enjoyed creating pictures that we can see either for our sins and our past or also for our future. And Ezekiel saw pictures of the future, the shape of things to come. Ezekiel, like Daniel, was going to see a future which would help John to interpret his visions of heaven. So the book of Revelation has a lot to depend upon the visions that we find in the years that Ezekiel became a pastor. So that's two leaders, two prophets. Both of them could have been priests, but the priesthood have failed. This was the day of the prophets, and we would see eventually even the days of the prophets would fail and give way to the coming of the Son of God. Thank you for listening. This has been a longer talk, I know, on Ezekiel. I suspect because I gave talks on it and things are much fresher in my mind. But I remember as a boy going through Ezekiel and just being amazed of some of the things that I read. A lot of it I didn't understand. You see, reading the Bible, you don't have to understand it to enjoy it. There's so much on the surface that will feed your spiritual life until you see the Lord Jesus Christ in glory. Born his Bible again. Thank you for listening. See you soon.